Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Zachariah Renfro, and today we're going to talk a little bit about economics and global trade. I do encourage you, if you can, I would get some paper or something to take notes. This lecture is going to be mostly definitional. I'm going to be describing a lot of things. I'm going to be throwing out a lot of terms and concepts, and I'll try and connect them together as best I can. But economics as a discipline is so complex that you can have entire lectures where it's just discussing different definitions, right? And obviously, I'm aware that this is a lecture for an introductory business class, and I'm aware that you're not going to be expert economist, and that's okay. So really the way to think of this is as a kind of stepping stone of something that you can look back on and remember. It'll remind you as you go forward in your studies. So with that being said, let's dive on in. These are the things we're going to cover. We'll talk about various definitions. We'll talk about economic measurement, capitalism, socialism, communism, modern mixed economies, and global trade. So first, just starting off with some definitions, right? You can't study economics without a strong understanding of these definitions. So first, what is an economy? It's the financial and social system that represents the flow of resources through a society from production to distribution to consumption. So what does that mean? That means that the economy is everything that happens from the time that a natural resource is um, harvested or mined or taken to the time it's processed, to the time that it's turned into a product, to the time that it's distributed, to the time that a customer picks it up and buys it and then consumes it, right? It's every step of that process. It's the laws, it is government policies, it is personal choices, it is spending, it is fiscal policy, right? Like all those things, global trade, interstate trade, right? It's all those things together. That is the economy, right? Now, typically when people talk about the economy, they're typically talking about in their particular like state or their particular country. Um, but when we think about it in the terms of business, we need to typically define our scale. Are we talking about the global economy, or are we talking about the economy of a specific nation or the economy of a specific area? I don't have to tell you that depending on where you look, you can see the economy is much different. So, for example, if you live in a big city such as LA, where there are lots of companies and lots of potential employers hiring, the economy is going to look a lot better than if you're in a place such as McCreary County, Kentucky, where there are not as many employers and there's not as much hiring and there's not as much opportunity, right? So when we think about economy in business classes, first thing we need to do is define our scope, right? Then economics is the study of the economy, right? So all that stuff I talked about with the economy, economics is the study of that. But economics also gets broken down into two smaller parts. We've got macroeconomics, which is macro, the word means big. It's a study of nations and their interactions with the global economic system, their interactions with each other, and then policies that affect them as a large group. That's things like tariffs, trade treaties, fiscal policy, right? And then microeconomics is a study of smaller units, such as individual businesses. How does Apple affect the economy of uh, Los Angeles? Families and individual consumers, right? If you ever see a study that talks about something like Americans are spending less on coffee and more on tea, that is a microeconomic study. That is a study examining the individual decisions, right? So at the macro level, it is almost purely like statistics and algebra At the micro level, then you start getting into bits of statistics and algebra with a little bit of psychology thrown in. So let's give an example of how these micro and macro things interact with each other. So during an economic crisis, governments might lower interest rates to encourage more spending. Lowering interest rates is a macroeconomic move. That is, say the US government through the Fed lowering the interest rate that it loans out to banks, encouraging them to lower their rates so that people will spend. And then the outcome of that is going to be increased consumer spending. Lowering interest rates is macroeconomic, increased consumer spending is microeconomic. Now, of course, if we have an economy and we've got macroeconomics and we've got microeconomics, we got to know how to measure that. And one of the ways, this is probably one of the most common ways, you'll see this in the news, is with GDP, gross domestic product. It's the estimated value of all goods and services produced by a country. You might see something that says that the GDP of the USA is about $32 trillion, which means that during the period measured, say 2025, the United States produced $32 trillion worth of goods and services. Now, when you're producing things, we have to also measure productivity, which is one of the other ways that we measure economies. And that relates to our ability to actually produce those goods and services. Higher productivity generally relates to increased GDP. Productivity is the more or less the speed with which capital and resources can get converted into products which can be sold. So if you've got really high productivity with a really efficient process, then you will typically have a higher GDP. And we measure GDP over something called a business cycle. A business cycle is a period of time in which you'll see the economy expand and things go up, and then you'll see it contract and things go down, and see it expand and things go up, and see it contract and things go down. Um, Depending on where you're reading or what you're looking at, a business cycle can be measured a bunch of different ways, but just know that when we're talking about measuring economies, we might be measuring them throughout an entire business cycle from peak to dip to peak. We might be measuring them across gross domestic product, and we might be measuring their productivity. Now, we've talked about ways to measure economies, and we've talked about some of these different aspects, but now we need to talk about some particular ways which economies can be structured. One of them is capitalism. If you live in the United States or Europe or most nations in the world, it will have some form of capitalist basis. Over the last few hundred years, capitalism has been the dominant economic force. Now, I do want to say that we do have to distinguish between, things like mercantilism, which was a type of constrained capitalism, which was controlled by, say, a crown, a monarch. And we have to distinguish that from what you might call a market economy, which is more like a primitive form of capitalism where things like business rights and private property may not be as well developed. So this is a system that was more or less finalized by Adam Smith in his Wealth of Nations. If you haven't read it, I'm not sure if I recommend that you read it. It is a very informative book, very educational, but it is very difficult. Um, and one thing I will say is that, a lot of people get a lot of misconceptions about Adam Smith. They think that he was absolutely in favor of completely unconstrained um, actions, but that's not true. He had a particular disdain for landlords, and he had a particular disdain for um, the aristocracy. He didn't feel like people should be able to really profit off of capital, which they have really had no way in developing. So there are four kind of general tenets of capitalism. That's the right to start businesses and keep profits, right to private property, right to choose and buying decisions and lifestyle, and right to fair competition. So we could have lectures about any of these four tenets, right? For example, there was a time during medieval periods where in different countries, certain trades and certain things were controlled by guilds. So there were certain types of things that you just as a private citizen didn't have a right to do unless you were a part of those guilds. Right to private property, depending on the time period, depending on the nation. We've seen that private property rights can be more or less restrictive. Some places they might have really strong private property laws. Other places it might be much more loosely defined, which is one of those things that will affect how people interact with the economy, right? So we think about U.S. efforts to try and develop Afghanistan. Afghanistan does have private property, but the system by which private property has been managed for the last centuries was a much more informal system and um, quite a bit different when it comes to establishing title of land. And because of that, it made it very hard to get businesses into places and get businesses developed because people had trouble producing clean titles. Because, for example, land for a long time was seen more as a community resource. And even in some villages in Afghanistan, the local elders can demand you to do certain things with your land. Next thing is the right to choose and buying and lifestyles. So you can have the other three ingredients, but if people aren't free to buy or free to choose how they live, it's not really capitalism, right? If the government tells you, hey, every month you must buy 4 kilograms of cheddar cheese, and so on and so forth, that's not quite capitalism. And then right to fair competition. Uh, that is that, businessmen have to operate ethically. Adam Smith would say with a Christian ethic, with a Protestant ethic, but they can't be out cheating, lying, stealing from each other, hiring mercenaries to kill each other or whatever. It is something that they do in fair competition to satisfy needs in the market, right? And when we think about capitalism, it's kind of best described with this anecdote, which Adam Smith brings up. And it is that the baker of bread bakes the bread not because he wants to feed others, but because he wants to feed his own family, right? So you have all these individuals doing things that are self serving, and the aggregate of that system is that people's needs get provided for because other people see that there is a profit to doing those things. And generally, that is generally true. However, for certain types of things, and this is just the truth, there are certain areas which are not quite profitable to cover, and that's where, things like government intervention come in. Or there are certain areas where, yes, there is a need, and yes, you can make a profit, but in doing so, it is rather ghoulish and kind of harms the conscience and the community. And in those cases, we may not want a system where that happens. So within capitalism, there are several types of competition. And this will depend on the type of product that's being produced and the market for it. So, pure competition is an environment where consumers can't distinguish the products and no business has control of the process. So, for example, like corn, individuals can't really tell who's selling the corn, it's a bulk commodity, and no single business controls the price of corn. That is just dictated by options and commodities and fear and so many things, but it's not like Walmart goes out and says, okay, this is the price of corn, um, because there isn't just one entity that controls it. Then you've got monopolistic competition. This is an environment where producers make distinct products and control the prices of their products. So, for example, in restaurants, right, we think about a small town. There is a Mexican restaurant, a Chinese restaurant, and a hamburger stand. Each one makes distinct prices, and each one makes distinct products, and each one sets the prices of their products, right? They are in control of their prices and their products, regardless of what anyone else says. If you've got the Mexican restaurant and then another Mexican restaurant opens, the other restaurant can sell tacos cheaper, but that doesn't mean that the first one has to do that as well. They might if they want to be more competitive, but they're not required to. Then we've got an oligopoly, which is a market where a handful of really big companies control it all. Think about Coke versus Pepsi. Think about Apple versus Microsoft. They the market is split in some percentage, but there are really just one or two or three big competitors, and everyone else is fighting for the scraps, right? We think about soft drinks. Coke and Pepsi dominate, and then there are tons of like micro soda breweries across the country that try and get into the market, and maybe they succeed, maybe they don't, but they're just fighting for scraps. And then a monopoly is a market where one business dominates everything, like the board game Monopoly. One owner gets a hold of everything and runs everyone out of business. So, for example, Google's been sued several times for monopolistic behavior, where they have essentially locked other people out of the search business or out of the software business. So, those are the different types of competitions we see within capitalism. We've got all these types of competition, and what that does, Adam Smith called this the invisible hand of the market, but that creates supply and demand. Here we've got graphs showing pizzas. You can have a whole lot of pizzas produced, and then you've got demand for pizzas going down, right? So the more pizzas we produce per day, the less demand there is for pizzas. But the fewer pizzas we produce per day, the more demand there is for pizzas. For example, I've got a daughter, and she gets into all these like trends that all the other kids get into. For a while, Labubus were the hot thing, and there was not enough supply for every kid to get one of these little Labubu dolls. So the price, because there was high demand for these, the price went way up because there wasn't enough supply and everyone wants them. But eventually, as more got produced, right, as more supply came in, the demand started to fall. At some point, you hit something called equilibrium. That's where your supply and your demand connect, and there can be several different curves. This is just one for a pizza example. You get equilibrium where they connect and the market finds a balance. So now, if you want to buy a Labubu, they're easy enough to find and the price is stable. You're not out there on eBay having to pay 6 times the price. Of course, equilibrium isn't the only factor that affects supply and demand. Another one is inflation and deflation. And this has to deal with the money supply. Basically, what happens with inflation is more money comes in, and that causes the demand for money to drop and the equilibrium moves. So inflation is when prices rise. The product itself hasn't improved or changed, but the price has rise because more money has entered the system. Hyperinflation, we see the same thing, but a more dramatic scale. That's when prices rise over time by more than 50% in a month. So you go to buy a hamburger and it costs you $10 today, and then tomorrow it costs $15. That's hyperinflation. Disinflation is the opposite of inflation, and that's when prices fall at a steady rate. Over time, prices drop because people aren't spending as much money. Perhaps interest rates have gone up, and that's causing people to take out less debt, and that's causing prices to fall. Whereas deflation is when prices rapidly collapse because the demand collapses. So, for example, there's an economic crash and then suddenly no one has any money. That would cause deflation. A little bit of inflation or a little bit of disinflation over time is typically good for an economy. It kind of comes in peaks and troughs, but a bit too much either way, and it can be a danger sign for the economy. It can be hyperinflation or it can be deflation. Now, when a government's facing inflation or deflation, there are a couple things they can typically do, a couple levers they can pull, and that's their monetary and their fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is adjustments to taxation and public works designed to encourage spending. So, for example, if the economy's struggling, typically if you cut taxes, more people are going to spend. And if you, at the same time you're cutting taxes, you also have the government spending more into, say, public works, repaving roads or building battleships or something like that, then that will typically encourage more spending, right? Those public works, they're employing people, those people are getting paid, that money's going back into the economy. So it's typically a way that you can kickstart a weak economy. Whereas monetary policy is adjustments to interest rates directly. That's when the Federal Reserve, for example, goes in and raises and lowers the prime rate. And that's the rate which banks borrow money from the Federal Reserve. And that's the rate that affects mortgage prices, for example, or car prices. That's another way that you can either put money into the economy or that you can take money out of the economy. Same with money supply. That's when the government sells more debt to print more dollars, and that gets more money into the monetary into the supply, which allows people to spend more and hopefully improves the economy. Now, we've talked a lot about capitalism. We've talked about how you measure economies. We've talked about hyperinflation and deflation, but let's cover a couple of other systems. So, socialism, or at least modern socialism, is an economic system where the government owns and operates key enterprises, the most important things, utilities, telecommunications, healthcare. It's ran by the government. People are able to vote and influence what happens. It's not just controlled by, say, a board of directors or a private owner. Taxes are typically higher, but incomes tend to be more evenly distributed. So what that means is that for people living in those countries, they typically do enjoy a slightly higher quality of life because their basic necessities are managed a little bit better and their incomes tend to be a little bit higher between top and bottom. Whereas within a more capitalistic system, you'll see huge gaps between the richest and the poorest. Then you've got communism, and there's a couple of different versions of this. You got Marxism and Soviet communism and Chinese communism, and they all have some slight variations. But this is a economic system where a strong central government owns almost every single enterprise. Typically, they make it illegal for private individuals to start businesses or to try and do things. For example, in Cuba right now, they get little coupon books to get their food. And if you try to sell food, maybe you get coupons that you and your family don't use. If you try to sell food to make a little bit of money, that's actually against the law, can land you in jail. Typically, communism has to maintain its control with extreme force and surveillance, things like gulags, death camps, work camps, massive prison camps. So, what we see is a system that can only stay in power when it crushes basically the wills of the individuals to try and operate within the system. It basically wants to create a society of people where the people are absolutely dependent on the government and don't really have any sort of will or determination of their own, right? And I do separate this from modern socialism because there was a very long period of time where socialism and communism were synonymous, but now times have changed and socialism and communism are still they're now different things. And, when you read some older books, you'll see them using socialism and communism interchangeably, but they're really not interchangeable anymore. There was a time they were, but they're not anymore. And then most modern economies typically have some mixture of state control and free market operation. So, for example, in the United States, a lot of the utilities are publicly owned because we find that having a utility owned by a private company can typically lead to worse outcomes for individuals. Because what that means in particular is that the company has an incentive to raise prices over time. And it's what you call a natural monopoly. There's only so many power plants that can be built in an area, only so many hydroelectric dams, right? And as individuals, we don't want to live in a place where the people running it have some sort of incentive to try and get more money from us as opposed to trying to keep our prices down, which in an ideal system would not be the case. Now, we've talked about socialism, communism, capitalism, the economy is how you measure an economy. Now, if we're doing all that, we might want to trade with our neighbors and we might want to know how we're interacting with other countries, which leads us to global trade. Most modern businesses are having to operate in a global context. And typically, if you are a large modern business, you really can't afford not to enter a foreign market because what it can do is not only provide you extra income, but it can provide stability over time. Say the economy in your country goes down, perhaps the economy is not going down in the other country you trade with. So these companies can't really afford to be isolationist. And if they do, they're going to suffer a harsh opportunity cost, right? So if you choose not to enter the global market, the price you're going to incur is going to be high. That's your opportunity cost. And an example of opportunity cost is, you can't study and go to the party at the same time, right? When you lock into an option, the other option goes away, right? Because at some point you have to either spend money or time or effort to do the option that you choose. And the moment you do that, it becomes impossible to do the other things. So that's opportunity cost. And you see that not just in economics and global trade, but even in your personal life. You are here a student at the University of Cumberland's. When you chose to go to Cumberland's, you made a decision and you put resources towards it, which meant that you couldn't go to another university. You're locked in. You've made a choice, the other option goes away. There are some different formulas and things that you can use to measure the value of an opportunity cost, but that, we're not going to cover that here. That's a bit more advanced. But just know that that is a concept that you'll see throughout your life, right? And when it comes to global trade and opportunity costs, you have to understand whether you have an absolute advantage or whether you have a comparative advantage, right? Absolute advantage means no one else can do it better, cheaper, more efficiently than you. So, for example, if you have a very strong tech sector and a very strong education system, you probably have an absolute advantage when it comes to software development. Whereas a comparative advantage is only things that you can do better than others in certain ways. So, for example, I might be able to produce alternators cheaper than my neighbor, but perhaps he can produce mufflers cheaper than I could, right? So where we find those areas where we have our advantages, it's best for us to initiate trade with each other, right? He'll trade me mufflers, I'll trade him alternators, and in that way, it creates equilibrium across the global economy, right? That was something we learned about earlier. Equilibrium. That's a balance between supply and demand. And when we lean into our advantages, and this is not just for businesses, but also for your personal life, when you lean into those areas where you have an advantage, then that's where you can really optimize and make the most money. So, for example, if you're someone that is really good at math, lean into that, really focus on doing the thing that you're good at. Whereas if you are someone who is not good at math, maybe don't go into that as much, right? Um, but that also, and this is just kind of one of those life lessons you can think about. Whatever things you're good at, you want to find someone like to be your partner, to be married to, or whatever, who's good at the opposite things, right? So if you're really good at like working on things with your hands, but maybe not with computers, then maybe marry someone who's good with computers, right? So you are able to exchange these abilities, and as a couple, you are able to operate more efficiently in the world because you're leaning into the areas where you have strengths. Now, thinking back to economics, these different advantages, whether it's an absolute or comparative advantage, leads to outsourcing, importing, and exporting opportunities, right? So, like I mentioned, if you can produce alternators better than anyone else, then you're probably going to want to export those. But if you're not very good at making mufflers, then you're probably going to want to import those, right? If the cost of labor in your country is too high, you might want to outsource it somewhere else. Whereas if the cost of labor in your country is really low, you might want to take advantage of that outsourcing people are trying to do. Then we've got balance of trade. So we're talking about importing, we're talking about exporting, and that's what balance of trade is. It is the balance between imports and exports of a country. Typically, you want to have a surplus, right? But let's talk about what that is. A trade surplus is when a company exports more than it imports. I am exporting more alternators and windshields than mufflers that I'm having to import. Whereas a trade deficit is when a country imports more than it exports, right? So if you're having to import a bunch of alternators, then and you're spending a lot more money on those alternators than what you're able to get from selling your mufflers, then, that's a problem, right? You need to find ways to improve that balance. Now, of course, in a closed system, like an economy or a global economy, right? So far, we don't have aliens that we can trade with, but with a global economy, the way that trades work, there is always going to be someone that's going to have a surplus, and there's always going to be someone that's going to have a deficit. Um, it's not exactly a zero sum game, but it's very, very close. Um, One could hypothetically imagine a scenario where every country has a trade surplus, but in reality, that's almost never going to happen. You're going to have, large swaths that are having deficits and large swaths that are having surpluses, and then you'll have some number in the middle that maybe have a bit more of a balance. And just like the balance of trade, you've got the balance of payments, right? So we're trading things, but typically what we're really doing is we're selling things. And this is the balance between the inflow and outflow of money in a country. So a deficit is when you send out more money than you bring in. So if alternators cost $200, but I'm only selling my mufflers for $100, and I'm only able to sell 50 mufflers, but I have to buy 50 alternators, then I'm going to be at a balance of payments deficit. I'm sending out more money than I'm bringing in. Whereas if I'm the country selling alternators and I'm selling alternators for $200 and I'm buying mufflers for $100, well, if I sell 50 alternators and buy 50 mufflers, then I brought in more money than what I sent out. And this balance of payments can also affect the currency exchange rate of a country or how much the money is worth in another country. You've probably heard of currency exchange rates. If you've ever traveled, you know exactly what that is. But let's use the dollar, for example. $1 is worth $1 here in the United States. If you go to Europe, the euro is worth €1 is worth almost $2, like $1.70. So if you want to get €1, then you have to spend almost $2, right? And the balance of payments for a country, same with balance of trade and same with all these things, is going to affect the currency exchange rate. Now, typically, countries want the value of their money to be stable. They want it to be locked in. They don't want the value of their currency to shift or fluctuate. And over different times, they've tried to do that in different ways. For example, they might base the value of the pound on the amount of sterling silver held by the crown. You might base the value of the dollar on the amount of gold held by the US government, with, a dollar being exchangeable to a certain amount of gold. Typically, almost every country in the world uses some kind of fiat currency, which is that the money is not tied to a natural asset, but is more or less tied to the credit rating of the country. It's a bit complex, but the simplest way that I can say it is the stronger and better your country is, the more your money's going to be worth. Simple enough. And then there are some countries that have tried to tie their currency to other countries. So for a long time, and I'm not sure if it's still like this, but for a long time, the Chinese yuan was tied directly to the value of a dollar. The Chinese government would do what it needed to do with monetary and fiscal policy so that they could keep the value of a yuan in line with the value of a dollar. Did that work? Maybe. Um, and then there are also some cases where countries will even just use another country's currency. There are several small countries in the world that are not really able to print their own currency and have special licensing to use things like the British pound or the US dollar. So, some final thoughts. Economics and trade, global trade, are incredibly complex subjects. Don't feel bad if you watch this from end to end and felt like, oh my God, what the F did I just watch? It's complicated, right? And this is just like the baby level, right? This is the introductory level. So if you want to make it up to those higher levels, you really got to understand these basics. But these basics are not simple because we're talking about a system of trade and interactions between countries and businesses and how their laws and their taxes and their fiscal and monetary policy affect the spending of money and the saving of money and investment of money and all that. So it's inherently complex. So don't feel bad if you don't get it right away. You may need to rewatch it. You may need to take extra notes on it. Just do whatever you feel you need to do to get a grasp on it. And don't feel bad about it, right? The biggest takeaways for you that I want you to get from this is there is a thing called macroeconomics, that's economics of things like countries, and a thing called microeconomics, that's economics of individuals. There's something called global trade. There is something called a foreign currency exchange rate, right? So with that, I hope that this has been informative. I hope it's been educational. And if you've had any trouble with it, do make sure you just watch it again, take additional notes on it, and I hope to hear more from you soon. Thank you.